Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's Common Lecture featuring Dr. John Locke. And I'm your host, Chris Johns from Philosophy. Okay, if you've never read Locke before, hello. Yes, can you hear me? Bring it closer. Bring it on home. All right. Is that good? Okay. I'll try to keep it right. If I don't, wave at me. Okay. If you've never read Locke before, you might find it a bit difficult, but I encourage you to do that very much. And my presentation is kind of designed to help you understand the main points that, at least the points that I think are important in the reading. To try to make the reading a little bit easier by interpreting some of it, and to provide some background, some historical background, some theoretical background into what Locke is doing, so that you can understand him better when you're reading him. And I do encourage you to read him directly, and but use the lecture and notes as your guide. As you can see, this wonderful picture of Mr. Locke here, born 1632, died in 1704, right? And he was a philosophy teacher and a physician most of the time. He was opposed to authoritarianism in politics, and he was a kind of a revolutionary. And one of the points that I want to emphasize, or I'd like to impart today, is the way in which Locke used the treatise to support the idea of revolution, and that is legitimized revolution. And I think it's a point that's entirely relevant to us today who are living in a troubled state. Yeah, and some of his main works here, he was very influential. This work here, an essay concerning human understanding, concerned mainly the principles of human knowledge, and including moral knowledge. Another very important work called A Letter Concerning Toleration, which was centered on the legitimacy of the separation of church and state, something that we sort of in the U.S. take for granted as fundamental to our Constitution. Also the idea of freedom of religious conscience. The idea was that everyone could live together more peaceably if we allowed people to have their own religious convictions, and that we didn't make any certain religious conviction the law. Okay, and then we have the second treatise of government, right here, what you're reading, written around 1688, possibly before, edited and so forth. It's said that some people say that this piece was instrumental in what was called the Glorious Revolution, or the Bloodless Revolution, and they attribute Locke to being somewhat responsible for that. That's something that you can read about elsewhere. It's a very important historical event in England. Okay, let me go over some of the cultural and historical background that influenced Locke, and I also want to point out some differences between Locke and Hobbes, which might help you think about those two figures. Right. Characteristic of the modern period is a crisis of authority, and mostly a crisis of a religious authority, and that is exemplified most prominently by the Protestant Revolution, which could be characterized most generally as a rejection of papal authority, that is, a rejection of the Catholic Church. So there are a lot of religious feuds and wars going on well before Locke, but during his time as well. It was very influential. One of the ideas behind this is that reason is authoritative, but religion is not, or it has less authority, or it has the same authority alongside of reason, and that's kind of how Locke treats it. He gives rational justification for his notions of natural law, but he also gives theological ones as well, so that's something to pay attention to. And it is, of course, science. I think you've gotten a sense from having studied perhaps some Descartes, maybe even some Galileo, and some Hobbes, Bacon, of course, that it's science and not the Bible that determines the nature of reality and God's agential role in it. Okay. Also characteristic of the time was, and part of what contributed to the crisis of authority was the discovery of lands abroad, namely America and other places where there are other people living who didn't share the same values, didn't have the base of knowledge that the Europeans had, and so this was kind of surprising and something to difficult to incorporate into a theological worldview, and so that was the challenge. And one of the important things was about this time, and say maybe, starting well before it, some significant socioeconomic changes going on in England and elsewhere. So the main one was this, what they say, the rise of the merchant class out of this socioeconomic stratum of feudalism, which was hierarchically arranged and very rigid, and so the class that you were born into, you tended to stay into, and you inherited your position, whether if you were a noble or a peasant or a merchant, and so forth. And the king was on the top, but perhaps a little above the king was the Pope, right? So all these kinds of hierarchical relationships came under challenge. In fact, let's look at this just briefly. This might help. Here's a nice little diagram of the sort of feudal hierarchy, right? And I'm sure your professors in your sections can tell you more about the details, but this is interesting to keep in mind. You had peasants and serfs on the bottom of society, merchants, farmers, and craftsmen here. You had knights and vassals, which largely did, the fighting and defending. You had nobles who were the main landowners, and then you had the monarch, right? And above that, you would have the Pope and the church, right? Well, one major thing that happened that Locke is sort of right in the middle of is that this class, particularly the merchant class, sort of started to get a lot of money, started to become a lot of wealth. And so they were able to do things with that wealth, like buy, land and have more power and so forth, which took them out of the inherited sort of hierarchy here and put them in it put them in a more powerful class. And as that happened, they sought ways to justify things like individual freedom, economic rights, and these kinds of things. Or at least they felt themselves justified in demanding these sorts of freedoms. Where in this system, you didn't have such rights. Whatever rights you had were limited to the class that you were already in. All right, so that's part of what's going on as well. Okay. Let me point out some differences from Hobbes. All right, if you've been studying Hobbes, you'll may get the impression that his view of human nature is more egoistic. And Locke tends to be more social in orientation. He believes that we're already in society. We already have societal interests, and we naturally care for the beings of the well-being of others, as well as our own. So that's one difference. Views of the state of nature similar, follows from the state of human nature. As you heard, the state of nature for Hobbes is solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? Not a fun place. For Locke, the state of nature was more social, But he does say that it was also inconvenient, and such that individuals, though, did not seek continual war against each other, but sought peaceful arrangements and agreements in order to better their lives. Right? So I suppose you could say that for Hobbes, there seems to be a strong element of fear in the state of nature, whereas for Locke, it's more just a kind of a state of difficulty, where we try to resolve our difficulties by setting up a civil government. Right? You could also look at some different views of freedom. Say for Hobbes, as he says, freedom is the freedom to do what you will. That's called the right of nature. Right? And for Locke, he says your will is constrained by the natural law, namely, do no harm. And I'll say more about that later. So views of natural law differ in this way, that Hobbes held that morality had no validity without a state apparatus to enforce it. Right? So there was nothing like justice or duty or obligation or any of these sorts of usual moral notions unless there was a state that could enforce those constraints or those duties. Right? So for Locke, though, held that morality had validity prior to the state. How he could establish that is maybe not so convincing, but he thought that it had to be that there had to be a natural morality prior to the state institution. Otherwise, there was no legitimacy for the state. And he thought that this validity consisted in the laws harm no one and help others. Right? And as well what was called the well-being of the people, which I'll come back to. The social contract for Hobbes is the promise you make to others to give up your freedom and power in the natural state and to give that power of constraining your will over to the state, right, whose rule is not to be opposed. And this is an important point for Hobbes. You do not overthrow the monarch by force, because that leads back to a state of nature. Right? For Locke, you give your right to punish over to the sovereign, but if the sovereign itself is the cause of abuse, then the people may revolt. And of course, there is a danger of the state reverting to the state of nature when that happens, so it must be done in a reasonable way, if possible. Right? As we can see, too, that the sovereign government must consist of a system capable of checking itself against abuses of power. So he sets up a system where you have sort of, what are called checks and balances, separate powers in government, so that the chance of abuse is much less. Also, the general method of laying out an argument is they're both similar in that they take the geometric method very seriously. You begin with definitions and then perhaps some axioms, and then you derive further truths just like you do in geometry. He doesn't do this, Locke doesn't do this as explicitly as, say, Hobbes does, or certainly as Descartes, but that's kind of in the background. Okay, let's look at I want to look at the main argument of the second treatise of government before we get into some of the details. So we can characterize it this way as the rejection of patriarchal law. Does anyone know what patriarchal law means? When we speak of the patriarchy, what are we talking about? The patriarchy and patriarchal law. What does the word patriarchy mean? Huh? Governed by men. Okay, right. So this is what law is. This is what Locke is rejecting here. In the first treatise, right, Locke argued against Robert Filmer's 1680 Patriarcha, or the natural power of kings, in which Fillmore sought to show that the right of a king to rule was derived from the Bible. And this is what's called the divine right of kings, and it was given to God by Adam and then handed down in a series of kings. And that's what made kings, or gave kings, the legitimacy to rule, because it is essentially sanctioned by God. Okay, so Locke is opposed to this, and he refutes this position by going through the parts of Scripture and saying, well, it says this, but it doesn't mean that, and this is false, and this and that. And so there is no scriptural authority for the divine right of kings, which is a pretty striking claim to make, especially at that time, to deny a traditional interpretation of Scripture. But nevertheless, that's what Locke did. That was in the first treatise. The second treatise, which you're reading, then sought to establish different grounds for the right to rule, that is, for the right of a civil government. Rejecting patriarchal law, Locke sought to supplant it with this law, right? And in Latin, salus populi suprema lex esto. This is on your, the first page of your reading. The welfare of the people is the highest law. Okay? So it's not, obey the king or obey the authority is the highest law. The welfare of the people is the highest law. So where does he get that? Well, it seems like a pretty good idea, I guess, right? And if you think about it, you might think, well, yes, everyone's welfare is what matters most, not just, say, one person or one group of individuals. Their interest, the ruler's interest, ought to be in the welfare of the society as a whole. Okay? So it may seem to us like this is kind of common sense, but in that day it was not. And the idea that the people had rights, say, even over that of a king, was very scandalous. And if you know anything about the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, which was influenced by Locke in some passages directly, you can see the colonists appealing to this idea that the people have a right over that of a king when the king is abusive to his subjects, right? So, and you can imagine the king reading this document and thinking, who are these clowns to suppose that they can assert rights over me, right? And so it was a very scandalous thing to do, and of course it was a cause for war. Right? But that's exactly what happened. Okay. So the king no longer has a natural or divinely given power to rule, because the right to rule derives from the natural power of human beings to maintain their welfare against absolute and arbitrary rule. Okay. Well, we could talk about, I could mention, I think I'm going to skip this for now, Locke's motives for writing the two treatises. But I mentioned one, to sort of legitimize revolution, and the other one is to kind of establish property rights, which Locke was also very interested in, and I'll say more about that later. And as I suggested, there is a socioeconomic change going on, so Locke was involved in this, right? Okay, so let's get to the treatise itself, and the first section called Of Civil Government, and a characteristic of the geometric method. Locke starts with a definition. So let's first define what political power is. Right? And you might ask, well, where does he get this definition? Well, that's a good question. Try it out and see if you think that it's true. If it appeals to your intuition about what civil government should be, and we agree on it, then that's all we need to do. So political power, right, had been defined as primarily patriarchal, as I said, right, where we have the father rules over the children, the husband over the wife, the master over the servant, the lord over slave. Okay. But now the political power is defined as the right of making laws with penalties of death. Doesn't sound very joyful, doesn't it? It doesn't sound very inspiring. But that's, if you think about it, the primary function of a civil, of political power. Right? The right of making laws with penalties of death. That is, the right of enforcing those laws. Okay? And then only all this for the purpose only of the public good. Right? So that, as you can see, that fits in with his definition of the highest law as the welfare of the people. Okay, so that's the beginning. Chapter 2 discusses the state of nature because it's important to see, if we understand this idea of the state of nature, why we might want to establish a civil government. Right? And as you saw, Hobbes did something very similar. He had a slightly different story to tell. There's a lot of similarities here, but there's some differences too. Okay? So, of the state of nature, Locke says political power must be derived from its origin, again, not from divine right, but from the natural condition of humankind. And here's a way of that he sort of sets up some axioms. What is the natural condition of humankind from which we could, derive everything else? Well, you think about it, the natural condition of us without any law, any civil law, is that we are in a state of perfect freedom. Right? That is, perfect freedom to order one's actions, to do what one sees fit, though within the bounds of nature, of the law of nature, and we'll take a look at in a moment. You might notice, as I said, that Hobbes does not see such a limit. His idea is that we have a right to freedom, and that means a right to do whatever you will. Right? Okay. The other condition is a state of equality. Right? This is also similar to Hobbes, in which all power and right is reciprocal, meaning that every individual has an equal right to freedom. So just as I love myself, so must I love another. Right? So whatever I regard for myself, I'm bound to regard in others. So if I harm another, I will suffer, and if I help another, I can expect to be helped as well. And so from this state of equality are derived what he calls the maxims of justice: harm no one, and the maxim of charity: help others. Right? So this is important from the standpoint of these moral prescriptions or maxims, right, are valid prior to the civil law. Right? They are valid in some sense before any sort of law is instituted. Okay. You might wonder how it is that, well, what happens when people don't help others, right? Doesn't that happen? Sure, that happens, right? So how do you enforce compliance with the natural law? Well, that is a difficulty. But Locke's argument is that you have to start with some law that's legitimate prior to the state in order to legitimize the state. Because then, if you don't, then the state and any civil government is not properly legitimized, and then it can do just what it wants and assert whichever power it deems fit. Okay. So it follows in this way that this natural condition suggests a natural law. Being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And you might, key into the idea of possession, because Locke has an argument for property rights that we'll go over very soon. And if you think about it, it's very important as far as your personal liberty that you be able to maintain your possessions. If you don't, then your very life is threatened, right? Okay. All right. There's another way in which Locke kind of legitimizes natural law, that is a law prior to the civil society, and that is for theological reasons. He says, for men being all the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker, they are his property, right? Made to last during his and not to another's pleasure. Right? So that each one of you are God's property means that you cannot violate that property that belongs to God. So we cannot violate each other. Right? So you can see, in this way, we get these two distinct grounds of establishing natural law. And there's one, the sort of natural way, the conditions of freedom and equality that follow from our natural desire for self-preservation, obliges us not to harm others. And theological, God's right of possession over us, derived from his labor, means that we are forbidden from harming others. Also might want to pay attention to the idea that we are God's possessions because he created us. So there's a sense in which God labored, although technically labor doesn't harm God much. But this idea of labor and possession is very much connected to his legitimizing the acquisition of private property, which we'll see quite shortly. Okay, and then from here, here we get close to the definition of civil government that we started with. Right? From this follows the right to punish transgressors of the natural law. So somebody tries to take your stuff, right? You have the right to punish them. If everyone followed the natural law, if everyone recognized it was in their best overall interest to do so, punishments would not be needed, right? But they are, because they are all too common, right? He says a power or a law that is useless without a power to execute the law. Okay, so therefore each person must retain the right of punishment always in the state of nature. Okay, but since that retaining, as Hobbes put it too, can lead to difficulty and does not give us the proper means of settling disputes. We need, says we need, unbiased judges to make decisions when disputes arise. Right? We need a way of settling agreements and to constraining people who are out of bounds and so forth. So for those reasons, there arises the need for a civil government. Right? But what's important here is that whether there's a civil government or not, you retain your right to punishment. And that feeds into the issue of the right to revolution, or right to revolt. If the government does not protect you, if the government abuses you, if the government doesn't supply what you need for your welfare, you have the right to overthrow that government, because you have that right in the state of nature, always to protect yourself. Okay, yeah. So that's the foundation of civil government. The next point I want to move to has to do with, actually has to do with slavery. And I think anyone reading Locke and comes across these passages has to be quite puzzled. And so I want to touch on this point. Especially in light of the emphasis on freedom and equality, you might be very puzzled by these passages about slavery. But first you have to have a sense of what he means by war. Okay? So in chapter 3 on the state of war, he calls war a settled design upon another man's life. Right? And in what condition is it justified? So we can speak of just war. right? It being reasonable and just that I should have a right to destroy that which threatens me, yeah, with destruction. For by the fundamental law of nature, that is, by preservation, my right and desire to preserve myself, one may destroy a man who makes war upon him. Right? When such men are not under the ties of common law of reason, they have no other rule but that of force and violence. So another justification for war, when another would make me a slave, that would be in violation of my natural right to freedom. Right? So there is, much more could be said about this, but there is a justification for war, and it's largely based on violation of one's freedom. Right? Someone wishes to take my life, I can wage war on them. Okay, now let's go ahead to the chapter on slavery, chapter 4. He says some things about the fact that you can't kill yourself and so forth. But this is the passage that I want to fix on. It's number 24, where he says the perfect condition of slavery is this: a state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Now, I just want to focus on that for a second and try to think about in what way, where could that be true? That this might be, say, a good defense or a legitimate defense of slavery, saying that it's a state of war between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Sorry? If you wrong the conqueror. Okay. Yeah. So, sure, if a group of people attack the, the monarch or whatever, then he can, keep them, certainly retain them, but then also use their labor power and so forth. It seems like a stretch to go from I will retain you to I will use your labor power, but in a way, I guess that's a way of enacting continued war on them. Right? Okay. Well, what do we know about slavery? I mean, when does that ever happen? That someone said, "Well, you waged war on me, so I'm going to make a slave out of you." Right? Where did that ever happen? I don't know. It's hard to imagine. There is one place where you might be able to say that happened, and that's see, the thing. Locke was also involved in the slave trade, right? And he was also involved in in plantation ownership and management in the Carolinas in the States, while he's writing this work. Right? So you have to think about how he can what's going on that he can have this sort of, he can lay out all this stuff about freedom and then go, oh yeah, and slavery is also legitimized, right? Well, when the colonists came to America to colonize, they encountered a lot of the native peoples, the Native Americans, called Indians, and got into scrapes with them, and was in a state of continual war with them. And of course, you might question whether that was a legitimate war, but in any case, there were attacks and killings on both sides, and so the idea was then, well, actually, whenever you conquered the Indians, you could enslave them, right, and use them for either on the plantations there in the States or send them off to Barbados, which they usually did, right? So that's one way to think about what Locke is doing there. But when you think about, say, the huge amount of transcontinental slavery that was going on between Africa and the U.S. that Locke was also involved in, it's very hard to see what the connection is between legitimacy of war and slavery, because the Africans were not attacking the colonists, right? So there's a really interesting and big puzzle about how Locke could do this, right? And why he would do this. So it's important to know, of course, that slavery was the business of selling human beings. It wasn't just a very casual thing or just about imprisoning a few people. It was a huge industry, right, that went on for hundreds of years, and it caused a lot of unnecessary suffering. One thing I like to do is show people this poster, this actual poster from 1769, about 100 years after Locke wrote the treatise. An advertisement for a cargo of prime healthy Negroes consisting of 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls, right, who just got off the ship from Sierra Leone, primed and ready for sale, right? Well, not so prime. So it was a pretty serious industry and highly morally questionable. So you might ask yourself, how is it that, how do you resolve this contradiction, if you can, between Locke's ideals and his support, at least ostensibly, for slavery? Right. There's lots that has been written about this, and you can read about it too. You can look it up. I have one article that I thought was very interesting called "The Carolinian Context of John Locke's Theory of Slavery," which gave me some very, very important insight. And I also like to point out too that before we sometimes we say, oh yeah, well that was then, they had slavery, people were wrong. Now we're okay, we're enlightened, we don't do that anymore, and we can congratulate ourselves that we're so much better. But we have to think about how we can live in our own contradictions, where slavery is still going on today, and we largely ignore it, or we don't do much about it. There are some websites that you can go to. You can look this up. In fact, according to the statistics, 35.8 million people live in slavery today, right? And 21,000 in Lebanon alone. Right? So that may be kind of shocking and surprising to some, and to some it won't be. Okay, let's look at one of the more important ideas is chapter 5 of Property, Locke's justification for property acquisition. Now, I might have to go through this a little quickly to see what's going on, but you might focus on section 27 in your reading and see how to make this out yourself. But here's what I'm going to suggest is going on. So, look, you have to imagine it, in a state of nature, no one owned anything, right? And so how is it that anyone comes to own something, right? Such that you can call it yours, and that gives an exclusive right to that thing, right? We sort of take this for granted nowadays because we say, well, if you want to own something, you just buy it, right? Well, but how did that get started, right? And now there isn't anything that is not owned, and so there's we can't show how it is that we might come to own something, except maybe maybe on Mars perhaps. So there are some who are planning on excursions to Mars to try to lay claim to it, right? So what gives them an exclusive right to it? What gives you an exclusive right to a piece of land, right? Well, Locke's argument is that it's your labor. And that is, if you work the land, you are, as he says, putting your essence into nature. Now, what could he mean by saying your essence? Is that that life itself is a kind of labor, because it involves consumption and expulsion of energy, right? And you need energy to live. And you need energy that you get from the earth in order to live. So if you put your labor into the earth, it becomes yours, such that if it is taken away from you, you lose your livelihood. Right? So it's really, in some way, it's all about self-preservation. We have to possess something in order to maintain ourselves, and we get the right to that thing by putting our labor into it. So a lot has been written on this idea. You can explore it further, but that's the basics of it. So in this, as he says, through my labor I turn what is common in nature into what is mine. Right? Okay. So that makes it very nice for for a situation in where, say nothing or very little is held, is already owned, so that you can acquire something. But very difficult nowadays if everything is already owned. Okay. Locke also shows how this idea gets extended, right? So yes, you can labor to acquire some property, but those things also that you own, if they labor too, then you can acquire more property, and you can acquire, more than you need, actually, which you're not supposed to do. But in any case, he says, so if my horse grazes the common, unowned land, then the land becomes mine. Right? And if my servant or employee works the common land, then the land becomes mine. Okay? So this gives rise to the idea of, can you acquire as much land or property as you want? Well, Locke says, no, you can't, because you can't, according to the law of nature, acquire more than you can use, because if you do, then it would spoil. Right? So if you make an overabundance of bananas, and you can't consume them all, and they spoil, you've produced too much, right? There's another constraint too, since in the state of nature you're not allowed to harm anyone, that if you take more land than you could manage, and that prevents others from attaining their needs, then you've acquired too much. Right? So that's how at least it's supposed to work according to the laws in the state of nature. And this is sort of made difficult because Locke also has an interesting idea about how to further extend your property right in a way that doesn't cause spoils, right? Doesn't cause waste. And that's through money, right? So, the coins and so forth do not spoil, so if you can purchase some piece of land or food or building or what have you, then you can keep it because it's represented by the money that you have, right? And it doesn't spoil. So as you can see, though, there's some tension here between how much you can acquire and how much is legitimately that you're able to acquire. Okay, so that discussion is through that section, and all right. So I had like 5 minutes to get to the revolution part. So we can kind of look over some of these points very briefly, and sort of a recap of why individuals enter into civil society, and the origin of legislative and executive branches of government, and the limits of monarchy are given in this section. Okay. Yeah, let's just go ahead and take a look at the pretty much the last section or chapter 19 of the dissolution of government. Okay. So in section 221, this states that when the legislative power, right, or the power, or when the legislative power, that is the power that makes the laws, or the prince, right, that who is usually the executive power, act contrary to their trust by invading the subject's property and to make themselves master, then what do you suppose? Given the law of nature, what happens if the legislator violates your property? Does the legislator have a right to do that? What do you think? Well, what would happen if they did, right? One thing is that the legislator would put itself in a state of war with the people when it did that, right? And this dissolves any obedience the people had sworn to the legislator, right? The people swear to the legislator to uphold the laws for their own good, right? For their own good. But if the legislator itself makes laws or performs in a way that violates the people's own good, then what? Right? Then the people are justified in rebelling against the legislator. Right? Okay. Interesting statement here. When people are made miserable, they will rebel, as they should. Right? And, he agrees with Machiavelli, who says a prudent prince, right, doesn't make people miserable if he wants to stay in power. Right? So, Locke also says here, revolutions occur infrequently and not for minor reasons, but if a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, they cannot but feel the crushing weight of this burden. Yeah? This line about a long trail of abuses was borrowed directly by the American colonists in a declaration to legitimize their breakaway from the king. I think, I don't know, if you think, I'm always reminded of what's interesting about living in Lebanon is that you can think, let's see, abuses, prevarications, and artifices. If I think about the role of the government, what is it supposed to do? It's supposed to preserve the wealth and the health of the people. And then I think about the electricity, the air pollution, the lack of water, the water pollution, slow internet, corrupt officials. A list could go on and on and on. It makes me think, things are not so different after all. Right? As it says here, to finish this line off, after a long trail of abuses and usurpations, the king has rendered himself eligible to be disposed. Eligible to be disposed. When the government has violated the rights of the people, it becomes the true rebels, right? It becomes true rebels because rebel means to make war again. So when the government abuses you, it is, in a sense, putting you back into the state of nature, into a state of war. He says, must we see our cities pillaged and laid in ashes, our wives and children exposed to the tyrant's lust and fury? No, we may repulse the present attempt, but must not revenge past violences. Right? So Locke was firmly believed that the people had a right to revolt, but he thought it should be done reasonably and without undue violence. Okay, that's it. If you have any questions, please email me. Be happy to try to answer them. See you.